Catherine, it's so great to have you on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, Davey, it's so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, just in our conversation prior to this, I've discovered that you and our other host Aubrey are very close, and
Yeah.
you guys are do life together. It's so great. So, I'm a friend of Aubrey's is always a friend of mine.
Oh, I'm
So
glad to hear
immediately
that. Well, likewise.
when I found that out, I said, "Okay, this is great. I feel like I know you already." But our listeners don't know you. And well, some of them may because they've read some of your work or they've heard of you or they've talked, but some of them don't. And so I would love for them to just get to know who is Catherine McNiel, where do you live, what's life like right now, and then I want to talk a little bit about your story.
I'd love that. Well, hey everyone out there. It's great to be here with you today. My name is Catherine McNiel, and I am a writer and an author and a speaker. I live near Aubrey, actually, in the suburbs of Chicago, where it is very cold right now. I have three kids, one husband. We're just getting by, these
Mm,
days, this COVID tide, but
mm,
we're hanging in there. So yeah, and
wow,
professionally, I am a writer. So I have three books that are traditionally published, and I'm always either working on a book or writing something else by contract. So it's
I
a good
love it.
it's a good way to go.
I love it. That's amazing. Well, I know that writing a book and
Mm-hmm.
getting it published is no small feat. And the fact that you have three out there, I commend you and congratulate you on that.
Thank you.
And what I love about writers in general is that you guys think deeply on things
Oh
and you
yeah.
consider things and you work through things and you're wrestling through things. And so, that's one of the reasons I'm really excited to have you on this episode because I want to draw out some of those thoughts. But particularly, you've got a story. There's so many facets to your story, but there's
Mm-hmm.
one kind of thread that we want to talk about,
Yeah.
and it's something that is in the conversation a lot right now. I feel like I'm hearing it a lot in terms of, other podcasts that are featuring different stories about this, and I think we're becoming awakened to this
Mm-hmm.
idea, and maybe the church is there's a shift that is happening, which I think is a very good shift. But a lot of it comes with there's been a lot of hurt in the
Mm-hmm.
church,
Yeah.
and people have experienced that, and your story is aligned with that. So I'd love for you, as you feel comfortable, I'd love for you to just kind of take us back and tell us a little bit about what happened, and how this organization, institution, whatever you want to call
Mm-hmm.
it, that's supposed to be the most healing and safe, comfortable place that we can know as human beings and followers of Jesus on this side of eternity,
Mm-hmm.
um, how it's has and can cause damage in our lives as well.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a really great way to open this up. Well, one thing that's, I think, a little bit unusual about my story is it happened to me when I was a child. I was 12
Mm.
years old when the main things happening that I'm going to tell you about went
Yeah.
down. And so, uniquely, I'm not saying I'm the only one, but unusually, this
Mm.
experience formed my understanding of church just as much as it shook my understanding of church.
Yeah.
So it's been something I've been wrestling with my whole life, basically. Um, it Our story begins in a small midwestern town.
Uh,
My dad was a pastor of a very small church in a rural farming community, and I think church was to me everything that you just described. And I don't think you can really understand my story without realizing how much church was home and family for me.
yeah.
We were I was 4 years old when my family moved to this church, so I don't really remember anything before.
Right.
So these people, this building, this community was everything that I knew. My dad being the pastor there was everything I knew about my family. And I even went to school there. There was a small
Mm.
private school that the church ran, and of course the pastor's daughter had to go there. So
Of course.
I
Yeah.
I was I was at church
It
literally
was your
every
life.
day. It was
Yeah.
everything. All the people that
Hmm.
I knew were church people.
Yeah.
Everything that I knew about myself, my own identity, my family identity was all wrapped up in this one basket.
Right.
And I guess another thing that's a little bit unusual, not that and not as unusual as I we might think, but a lot of the church drama that we hear about right now, it takes place. It's a, they almost always have something to do with the misuse of power, but the power
Right.
is tending to reside with the pastor. Maybe the pastor started the church or grew the church or
Yeah.
is platformed or celebrity in some way. But in these rural communities, that the power dynamic is very different, and
It's
I
quite the
think it's
opposite. Yeah.
yeah, it's really important to understand that, to understand how this all played out. The church that called my family um, was kind of a legacy church. I don't remember
Mm.
all the specifics now, but the immigrant farmers started it uh, long ago, but their
Yeah.
great grandchildren who are now working those same farms were still leading the church.
Mm.
And so, unlike an urban or a suburban church where maybe the pastor is kind of the anchor and the people are going to come and go,
Right.
here it's these core families, it's the congregation that is never leaving for generations, and the
Right.
pastors come and go.
Right.
So that's a really important dynamic, I think, to
Yeah.
understanding what happened.
Yeah.
Um, Basically, the story begins one day when my dad was very abruptly fired, and
Mm.
I'm not going to go into the details of why that is, and I'm not going to hash out whether he and the church should have parted ways or not.
Yeah.
I think probably they did need to part ways,
Yeah.
um, but not the way it happened. And
Mm.
basically, what happened is he walked into a meeting, um, could easily read the room,
Yeah.
and like I was 12 at the time, so I'm going to get some of the details wrong, but I believe my family had 2 weeks to be out of town
Oh
entirely.
gosh.
Um, and
Wow.
so, yeah, that's it's one thing to kind of read about that, but that
To
means that,
experience it.
yeah,
Phew.
instantaneously I lost everything. I
Everything.
lost my literal home, like the house that I lived in. I lost
Wow.
my community, my church, my school, my friends. Um, I lost, in some ways, my family and my sense of self,
Mm.
because obviously the fallout of this went on for years. So
Wow. Phew.
yeah, uh, and there was no grace for my dad or for my mom, for us kids. There was no path towards healing or a future. We had to leave immediately. And this was even before there were kind of best practices around severance and health insurance, and
Right.
it was a very very immediate severing
Yeah.
from of everything that I knew. Um, so in
Mm.
one moment, I lost my literal home, my entire community, my school, my church, my friends, the sense of family that I had, the sense of identity that I had. We literally didn't have a place to go. We literally moved in to like a basement of a relative who took us in for a while, and my parents started a very long
Yeah.
scramble to try to gain enough stability for themselves personally that they could create stability for us as a family.
Wow.
Um, and not only
Man.
did the church handle this extraordinarily badly, but there are a few individuals from the church that reached out to us individually, but for the most part, I never saw or heard from anybody again.
Mm.
So
Phew. Man.
I was 12 when that happened.
Which is a very
Um,
pivotal year, right? I mean,
yeah,
in any
yeah,
childhood, that's you're very much aware enough of what's going on that
hmm
it begins to cause, a lot of questions and a lot of
yeah,
even, lies or things to creep inside and start to taint your perspective on certain
hmm
things. And then also you're young enough that you have zero control or agency
yeah,
over what is happening and don't know how to move forward. God,
yeah.
man,
I
I'm
have
sorry, Catherine.
Thank you. I have really vivid memories of just being in my room and listening to my parents in the house, like trying to trace where they were going, and because I was
Mm,
supposed to be in bed, and trying to just piece it all together, trying to understand what was going on. The
right,
emotions were high, to say the
right,
least. Just trying to wrap my mind around what was happening and why, and being at the kind of awkward age where no one really wants to tell you, but you're old
right,
enough that you know.
right.
That's now, as a parent myself, I'm really sensitive to that. Just sometimes we try
Mm,
to protect our kids by not telling them the things that they know, and then don't give them the
yeah.
opportunity to process openly. So,
Mm,
there's a lot of ways you could tell this. Just the financial security,
yeah. Yeah.
the logistical loss, the changing of home and school and church. But for me, it just felt so much like abandonment, um,
Mm,
and betrayal, because um, the people who had been my whole world, my whole community, my
right.
family, um, immediately decided that we couldn't even be spoken to, couldn't be loved or cared for in any way.
Mm,
Um, and they weren't strangers to me that did this. They were
right.
everything to me. And what they separated us from was everything in my life.
Mm,
So I don't want that to sound overly dramatic, but it did a number on my
it,
ability to
yeah.
trust and to be in
Yeah. That.
relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. How long would you say in the the period after that, um, did it take for you guys to kind of regain some sense of stability again?
It was years,
Mm,
because if I think we've all gone through some upheaval, like we've
right.
lost a job, we've had to move, we've lost a school, like we've lost one of those things.
Yeah.
But to lose all of them at once, like you don't even have
Right.
resources. It's like if you're falling, but you can catch yourself.
Yep.
There was no solid ground at all. There was nothing that we could hold on to.
Right. Right.
Uh, so
Phew.
it was years of even just finding like a place where we could live. And my
Mm,
dad couldn't just really go out and get another job as a pastor for
yeah.
after being fired like that, and also just the emotional state we were in. So he went through a long period of like selling shoes at the mall, and
Mm,
just trying to get by. And uh, my mother was devastated, and there was just so much fallout, and it took
right.
years.
Right.
It took years for the fallout to stop kind of escalating, much less, like when something explodes, it takes a
Yeah.
while for the explosion to come all the way, the wave to go out, but then it has to come back in, and
Right.
uh, it uh, there's a very specific memory that I have of God really facing me down and saying, I have to deal with this.
Wow.
I write about that, actually. It's the opening story in my book, Fearing Bravely. But
Mm,
um, that happened when I was in my early 20s. So, and this
mm,
happened when I was 12. So it was at
wow.
least a decade.
Yeah.
Um, but it's
Yeah.
also the story of my life. I
Right.
don't think about it every day now, but it formed who I am more than anything.
Right. Yeah. What to that point? What kinds of ripple effects could you kind of parse out for us in terms emotionally?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously there are financial ramifications and stuff for
Mm-hmm.
your family and occupational, but for you as you're trying to grapple with this as a 12-year-old and then
Mm-hmm.
beyond into your teenage years and early adult years, can you name some of those things that you would say, okay, now that I've really had some time to untangle, everything that the aftermath of what happened,
Mm-hmm.
here's a ripple effect. Here's what I notice. I mean, is there some things that you can kind of show us that would help us to
Yeah.
know how this affected you?
I mean, there's a lot of really practical ones.
Yeah.
I never really regained a sense of home. I don't know that I still have, to be honest. I'm in my
Oh,
40s now, so
wow.
this was a long time ago. But my family having felt so at home in the
Yeah.
community where I was, my family moved a lot in, trying to like find a
Right.
new
Right.
kind of moving from the next possible survival step to the next. So the
Wow.
rest of the time that I was in junior high and high school, there was really no stability.
Hmm.
So it's only been really since being married and having my own kids and my own family that I've I've been able to put down some roots and build home.
Kind of like
Um,
formulating your own stability. Yeah.
yeah, and to be honest, I'm an Enneagram 6. This is definitely why, like they talk about kind of like the
Yep.
inciting event.
Yep.
One thing that I've had to wrestle with a lot recently, strangely, 30 years in, um, is how hung up I am about providing security for my kids.
Hmm.
And
Wow.
maybe, which is good, it's good
Absolutely.
to
Yeah.
do that, but
On a healthy level. Yeah.
right, but I think I'm not able to let go and realize that some some upheaval is okay. Some
Yeah.
change for my children is all right.
It could impede, certain things that the Lord wants to lay out to,
Yeah,
grow your kids or to grow your family or
absolutely.
to, I mean, even just the idea of being able to answer a call,
Mhm.
of the Lord
Yes.
to move. Sometimes things like what you've experienced can very easily cause us to start to grip things so tightly because we're searching for that sense of stability. And
Yeah.
so we plant those roots, we dig those heels in, we say,
Yeah.
nope, not going anywhere because we want it so badly. And it can hinder us from being able to go, all right, Lord, what do you have for us? I feel, like my dad was a pastor as
Mhm.
well growing up, and we moved a lot, 2 years here, 2 years there, 2 years here, 2 years there. And it's interesting that you said that you feel like you still are trying to gain a sense of home.
Mhm.
I resonated with that, it feels this in a lot of ways the same way for me. Um,
Yeah.
what as you think through that, to what degree do you feel like, 'cause I wonder this myself, to what degree do you feel like, you know, we're supposed to have that, and to what degree do you feel like we're not? I know it's not
As
black and white, but in just
as
in
people or
yeah, as people,
yeah.
as especially people here,
Mhm.
um, on this planet that is not our home.
Yeah.
We go the
Yeah.
extreme there, right? And go, well, this isn't our home. And yet at the same time, it's very important for us to have a sense of home and to feel a
Right,
sense
right.
of. So, can you kind of, I don't know, ruminate on that a little bit? Like,
Yeah.
as
Oh,
you're
I can
wrestling through
always
that sense
ruminate.
of home, what is that for you? Where are you? What has the Lord been doing in trying to wrestle with that sense of home for you?
Yeah, this is kind of the rumination of my life, to be honest. And I think
Yeah.
maybe before I answer that question, I'll go back and add in another thing to the sense of
Okay.
home
Yeah.
has just been uh, experiencing what felt to me at least as abandonment, like whole
Mm,
scale by everyone that I knew,
yeah.
which is I'm sure an hyperbole, but that was the impact. Whether that was the intent, that was the impact.
Absolutely.
It
Yeah.
it has made it very, very hard for me to trust. And
Yeah.
nobody that I knew in junior high or high school ever heard this story, ever knew anything about where I came from.
Mm,
Um, it wasn't until college where I met the people who are my closest friends to this day, and I bravely, bravely risked telling them who I really was and where I really
mm,
came from, and found so much healing in doing that. But to this day, and to this very minute on this podcast, it's a very hard story for me to tell, and I
mhm.
don't open up about it very easily or very often, and uh, it has been an ongoing journey with much therapy and counseling and prayer and spiritual direction for me to trust people, to be in a
Mm,
relationship, to be known. Um, like probably a lot of pastors' kids and a lot of
yeah.
firstborns, I tend to take kind of a I will pour into you and you won't even
Mm.
notice that I'm not trusting you at all.
You're reading my
kind of,
mail over here, Catherine.
yeah,
You're reading
kind
my
of an
mail.
approach.
Wow.
And but that's not healthy, and that's not real life, and that's not real relationships. And so I think, going back to your question about home, I think a lot of times home isn't a really nice structure, a building where you keep all your stuff. I think home is the people that know you and
Mm.
that you even know yourself by. And that's what was so profoundly ripped from me,
Right.
at
Right.
that age where you're starting to figure out who you are in the world. And that's what I've had God consistently wrestle with me about.
Mm.
I've never really felt safe in a community, not physically safe, but
Right. Right.
trusting and
Emotionally. Yeah.
emotionally safe. And I absolutely hold myself back, and I absolutely hold myself, in the margins, and I do so
Mm.
effectively that my friends listening to me right now are going to say, what is she talking about?
They
She's
wouldn't
always in
know.
the center of everything.
Mm.
And that's exactly how I do it. I do it so well that no one would ever call me on it,
Mm.
although someone recently did.
You're
So
you're channeling that three is is what's happening.
yeah,
You're,
yeah,
was
going
that
to
going from the six to the disintegration to the three?
yes, that's what I
That's
do.
what we do. You
That's
know,
what we
we I'm a
do.
three, and that's it's we can put on the performance to make everybody think that we are, being vulnerable, and
Hmm.
and yet there's this little part of us that we're holding back, and
Yeah,
we can be vulnerable to an extent.
right,
You know,
right.
you can
Oh
say,
yeah.
hey, but like what you're saying, you put yourself right in the middle of it. You can play the part, but you're holding yourself back from really being able to connect with other people,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
and thereby reinforcing exactly this level of distrust that you're experiencing,
Hmm.
because it's impossible
Exactly.
to trust unless you put yourself out there vulnerably.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
So going back to your question about home, I I do believe strongly that we are not made for this world, like you said, that our true
Mm.
home is in God, and that, we have longings to be known
Yeah.
and to be loved that we're never going to fill up. And that
Yeah.
those longings need to not push us towards disintegration, but point us
Right.
towards Jesus. Um, but I also believe strongly that God made us to be in community and to be known not by looking in the mirror, but by looking at a friend. And,
Mm.
I think when our trauma, see how I'm building a wall between myself
Yep.
and what I'm saying. I think when my
It's
trauma
true. Yeah.
has stopped me from trusting a friend to know me,
Mm.
then I do disintegrate, and I am losing,
Wow.
what is best for me and what is God's plan for me.
Wow. Wow. Eh, I mean, surely along this journey, you've kind of picked up some bits and pieces of wisdom on all this. But how do you do
Mm-hmm.
that?
Mm-hmm.
How do you willingly go back into a relationship when your community was essentially the thing that was dismantled in such a
Mm-hmm.
hurtful way? How do I struggle with the same thing a lot of times, experiencing certain church hurt, so to speak, whether it was while I was a pastor, or
Mm-hmm.
whether it was while I was, pastor's kid.
Mm-hmm.
And I've noticed recently it's caused a level of distrust in myself,
Mm-hmm.
and it impedes relationships that I have. So how do I
Yeah.
lean into those relationships even when, like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Feels a little bit safer to just to take this posture instead,
Yeah, it's so much safer, but it's also so much, and I'm preaching to myself here, but it's so much safer to just stay in bed all day, but you can't live that way.
Right.
And I mentioned that I lead with this story in the first pages of the first chapter of Fearing Bravely, risking love for our neighbors, strangers, and enemies. And
Mm.
I don't actually make reference to my childhood at all. I just sort of vaguely
Mm.
say that I'm wrestling with God in a church service about a trauma. And I can hear God, not audibly, but as clearly as I have ever heard God saying, okay, it's time for you to lift up your face to me and lift up your hands and let go and trust
Mm,
me and open yourself up to relationships. And I'm like, no, no,
mm.
that's not gonna happen. Like, just hard no.
Yeah.
And I had this experience where God was, dare I say it, negotiating with me. And he was like, well, okay, what if I just, what if I give a little bit more and ask you to give a little less? And hard no, just hard pass. Like, I just turned him down flat over and over again. And God finally worked me back to a starting point of forgiveness where no, I
Mm,
wasn't going to forgive. No, I wasn't even going to want to forgive. But I was willing to say that I want to forgive. Um, and that's where everything started for me. God really convinced me
mm,
by showing me my own fear that the relational version of just never getting out of bed, of just
mm.
choosing to not let anyone know me or see me, um, was, I thought, placing me in a safe place, but it was locking me in a room with fear.
Yeah.
It was making sure that all the love stayed outside of the locked door and all the fear was staying inside the locked door. And I was being
Yeah.
held captive. I thought I was keeping myself safe, but I was being held captive by fear. And I was being
Mm.
kept separate from love. And God was saying, okay, enough now. We have to
Wow.
help you get out of this locked door.
Wow.
Um, and even though I can vividly remember and describe that one day, it's not like it was magic. I have
Yeah.
spent my whole life since then trying to love in the
Mhm.
face of my fear, and I am I still have a ways to go.
Yeah. Yeah. I know this may not be true for everybody's story, but I feel like we hear so often that there is usually some key people that are involved in our healing, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And I would have to imagine there might be some
Yeah.
very, key monumental moments involving
Mm-hmm.
key people along the way that God has used to, help you have an emotional, positive emotional response or, emotional experience with community or with safe, trusted
Mm-hmm.
people that has invited you back into
Mm-hmm.
trusting. Would you say that that is true of your journey? And if so, can you maybe describe some of those key moments, key people that, wow, this encounter right here really helped to peel back the layers of some of this distrust or this.
Absolutely. Well, without a doubt, my college friend and to this day one of my best friends, Mandy,
Mm.
is the very first person I ever spoke a word of this to, and probably to someone else, it's just another story. It's just someone else's life story. But for
Right,
me, it
right.
it I thought it would kill me to say these
Mm.
things out loud. Um and she listened and she loved me, and that changed my life. It literally changed my life. And it allowed me to tell a few other people. It allowed
Mm.
me to um, take steps to being known and take steps to trusting, even if they were
Yeah.
baby steps. I can definitely remember when I told my now husband this story. That was a huge, huge moment of choosing to be known. Um, there was a small group at a church that I was a part of. Um, that was it didn't last for very long because we were all kind of newly married, newly having kids, and we ended up all moving to other parts of the country. But um, it was unusually good by any small group standards, and
Yeah.
the fact that I was able to spend a few years in community with these friends, I think was a gift from God because uh, it was everything that I needed it to be.
Mm.
I haven't found that since,
Yeah.
um, but that community was profoundly healing for me as well.
Mm. Wow. Do you you know a lot of times people are experiencing these things and it, if they leave a church or if they feel like they've been hurt by a church, whether it's in the manner that you have or whether it's been in a different type of a situation, they experience similar to what you've experienced. It's almost like a complete cutting off of,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, I won't say I don't know if I can put a quantity for it, but there are times that I've heard of that it's almost like whether it's spoken overtly or whether it's just kind of understood. It's like when someone leaves or is fired or is we're not supposed to speak to them, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if
Mm-hmm.
people know even why they're not supposed to. It's just
Yeah.
like culturally that's the moray of the church right there, that it's like, so what would this have changed at all if there were some people even within the church that had just kind of reached out well and walked with you
Mm-hmm.
guys well? How would you, I guess I'm trying to get a picture for like, I feel like we've all been in situations where even other people have been, the ones
Yeah.
exiting for whatever reason. And we've observed that and we've, you know, fallen into the trap of like, okay, we're not talking to them or we're not. But I want people to understand like how drastically that could shift someone's
Mm-hmm.
life
Oh yeah.
if we
Yeah.
how would you advise us in that as the church? Let's say you're talking to the church body and you're going, hey, here's my experience. What this would have changed things for me. What would
Yeah.
that look like? Because we don't. 'Cause a lot of times we don't know how to. Right.
Right. Somebody once said to me, when someone is suffering, err on the side of presence. And
Mm,
that really strikes me. There was one family from the church who, not in an official capacity at all, but came to visit us in the new town in the new state that we sort of landed in temporarily. We definitely were migrants for some time.
mhm,
They came to visit us. I think just once. They brought bags of groceries because we didn't have many
mm.
groceries, and they brought bags of clothes. We didn't have many clothes, and specifically, they gave me a calling card. And this was the 80s and the 90s, so
Oh yeah.
this wasn't the internet. There were no cell phones. There really was no way to stay in touch with people unless you were very, very intentional. And
Yeah.
um, just I was probably had turned 13 by then. A calling card was everything. It
Mm.
meant that they saw me, that they
Wow.
saw kind of my stage in life. My probably people don't even know what a
Yeah.
calling card is, but
Yeah. I know. I was gonna say a lot of our listeners might not, but you're
it
right.
was
It
how
opened
you
up a
made a
form of
long distance
communication.
phone call before cell phones. It allowed me to make a couple of calls to the
Yeah.
friends that I had left, and that was awkward because it was their parents who had kicked us out of town. So I didn't do that
Mm,
very much, but I will never forget. I can see this man and woman standing in our yard, um,
mm.
and they weren't people I knew very well, and they're not people I've heard from since, but just that they drove to show up and see us, and they
Yeah.
had that one little gift for me. I remember it 30 years later, and
Wow.
so I think just do what you can, and it might not be magical and it might not be perfect. And some people love to cook, and some people like to buy gifts, and some people are great at sending a note. And you don't need to live into somebody else's giftedness. Just whatever it is
Mm,
that you do, reach out to reach out to the person the way
yeah.
you do it.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow. Wow. One of the things I love you said, a little earlier is that this, as you shared with, what was your friend's name in college?
Mandy, Mandy.
Mandy. As you shared with Mandy, and she became this safe space to receive that and walk with you in that, it gave you the courage
Mhm.
to do it again. I
Mhm.
think that's so profound
Yeah. I.
because I don't know if we really think about how much we're emboldening people just by being a safe space.
Mhm.
And we're like, it's like a domino effect, There's some
Yeah.
momentum on the tracks now of healing just by being that first person to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Once you
Um,
do something that feels impossible once, you can maybe
yeah.
try it again. And even just sharing this with her, I was able to share other things with her. And even before getting on the air with you, I was literally crying and sobbing and thinking, I
Mm,
don't know that I can do this, but
yeah,
I can because I've done it before.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. You can. And that's where, this book that you wrote, Fearing Bravely.
Mhm.
I mean, that's what's so profound about that dichotomy of concepts right there.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, can you unpack that a little bit more for me? I know you
Yeah.
just said you didn't really mention specifically this
No.
trauma within that book, but you referenced it, tangentially. But it's what's the basis behind this concept of fearing bravely? How has that impacted you?
Well, like you just said, I it's not a book about this trauma at all.
Yeah.
Although I think maybe more than I realized as I was writing it.
I was gonna say it
Um,
sounds a whole lot like it was formulated
yeah,
out of it. Yeah, for
yeah,
sure.
yeah. The subtitle is Risking Love for Our Neighbors, Strangers, and Enemies. And
Mm,
I'm looking at Jesus' consistent and persistent invitation, teaching, command that we live, that followers of Jesus live in the world out of a posture of love towards
mm,
our neighbors, towards strangers, and even towards enemies. But how, in reality, so much of the time, we're afraid of neighbors, strangers, and enemies, and we're making our choices and choosing our posture based out of that fear rather than the love. And
right, right.
my point is not that everything's fine, that everything's safe. Like the second
Yeah.
chapter is called Unsafe and Unafraid because the world isn't safe.
Mm,
There are so many people who somehow believe that if we follow Jesus and if we have a relationship with God, then everything's gonna work out fine.
yeah.
And you and I really know that's not true. Uh,
Right, right.
Life is full of suffering that we don't even think we can hold up against.
Yeah.
Um, but God is inviting us to this love. And it's a love that can fill us up. And then Jesus points us out and says,
Mm,
now love your neighbor. Now even love strangers.
mm,
Now love even your enemy. And I think so rarely do we ever get to the point where we realize that God is a God inviting us to love rather than fear.
wow.
We don't even think to turn out and and walk into the world with that
Yeah.
love.
Yeah.
But that's Jesus' invitation to us, not because things are safe, but
Yeah.
because we are loved.
Well, in order to do that, doesn't it on some level require trust,
Yeah,
right? I
yeah,
mean, it kind of comes back to the, full circle within this conversation of trust because it's like if we're really going to be followers of Jesus that love the way that Jesus
mm-hmm.
commanded us to love, and he only commanded us to love, excuse me, that way because he knows that it's what's best for our soul. It's what brings
Mm-hmm.
the most satisfaction for our soul. And that when we let down our guard and we become vulnerable in that trust exchange right there, whether
Yeah,
it's a friend, whether it's a neighbor, a stranger, or an enemy, it doesn't matter who it is. There's a level of trust exchange that has to happen. I'm trusting that when I love you well, when I'm vulnerable enough and I fear bravely, and I
mm-hmm.
love you well, that you're not going to do something to harm me. And if you do, I
Mm-hmm.
trust that God's got it taken care of. Like,
Yeah,
it all comes down to this, and that's what I think, is so beautiful about your story and you writing this, even though those two things weren't necessarily connected. That's you're on this journey that so many of us are on, and just this wrestling of trust. We've
mm-hmm.
been hurt.
Yes, and we will
We've
be
all
hurt
been
again.
hurt, and
Yeah,
we will continue to be hurt.
mm-hmm.
And somehow we have to like face that confrontation again to say, am I, and make that decision. Am I going to lean in
Yeah,
or am I going to just show up and put on the front?
yeah, yep. Yeah, in a different book that I wrote, called All Shall Be Well, I
Mm,
described another prayer time where I was wrestling with God. I was going for a walk at a forest preserve, and there was this kind of meadow full of flowers, and
mm,
I felt like God was telling me to take off my shoes and socks and just really like run through the field. And
hmm,
so there's a metaphor here.
mm-hmm,
My complaints towards God were not all about my feet. They had a lot to do with my heart. But I was like,
mm.
why would I do that? I know I have life experience that tells me there are rocks in this field and there are bees and wasps and snakes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to do that. That's not safe. And but of course I meant my heart. Of course I meant worshiping God joyfully is too dangerous for me. It's too dangerous to open up my heart that
Yeah.
fully and just frolic and just dance and just sing.
Yeah.
I know how like you said, like we have suffered and we will suffer again. And once you
Yeah.
really know that, it's hard to walk forward with your heart open.
Mm.
Um, but that is what God is asking us to do.
Yeah.
To say, I know that there are thorns, and I know there are rocks, and I know there are bees, but with my eyes on God and with my hands in the air, I'm going to take off my socks and I'm going to run.
Wow.
And not because I'm trusting God to direct my steps so that I never fall, because I am going to fall,
Mm.
but because it's the only way to be alive. It's the only way we can be alive.
Wow. Wow. That's so good, Catherine. So good. I don't ever want to give the impression that we're like we've kind of come to the end of our journey and we've figured it
Mm-mm.
all out by any means because we're always in progress. But I'm curious as you're wrestling with it because I ask this because I'm wrestling with it. So I'll lay my cards out on the table first
Mm-hmm.
before I ask you to be vulnerable. But I think the past 2 years has really disoriented me in terms of church.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a pastor, right? I
Yeah.
don't pastor a local church, but and in a lot of ways, I'm grateful that I don't pastor a local church in the midst of all of this. All of my pastor friends who have been having to navigate COVID and all of the political conversations, the race conversations, and not seeming to be able, no matter what they do, it feels lose lose.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't envy their position, and I empathize with them, and I want to walk with them. But I still am a pastor. I serve the local church through more itinerant speaking, and yet I feel this like I'm unhinged right now,
Mm-hmm.
going like, what's my relationship with the church?
Mm-hmm.
What is this supposed to look like? Because I've experienced hurt, and I've experienced some things I don't like.
Yeah.
So what's your relationship with the church now?
Hmm.
Where are you at
Ooh.
with all of that?
The last couple years have been hard. I guess we're kind of skipping a lot of years.
Yeah.
I began this story when I was 12, and now we're zooming forward to my 40s. I've had a rocky relationship with church.
Mm.
I loved as a child being the PK, the pastor's kid.
Yeah.
I adored I do, I still, I adore my dad.
Mm.
I still think he's the best pastor I've ever met, best
Mm.
dad I ever met. So I loved that the world before all this happened. And I hated the world after it. I hated everything
Mm.
about it. It was really terrible in every respect. My dad even had cancer in his body, and we didn't have health
Oh
insurance,
man.
so he couldn't have it taken
Oh.
out. I mean, it was bad. It was really bad.
Hmm.
Um, and it was the church who had put again, I do think that our family needed to leave that church at that
Right.
time, but it didn't have to happen that way. And it
Yeah.
was it
Yeah.
was the betrayal and the abandonment. Uh, you know, when a church, my dad and I were actually just talking about this. When a church calls a pastor, there's so much beautiful spiritual language about
Yeah.
discernment and prayer and calling and uh, welcome and family, and then
Mm.
when things become inconvenient, those words aren't used anymore,
Yeah.
and I think if those words had been used on the way out as well as on the way in, this would be a very,
Mm.
very different story. But
Wow.
it took, being a teenager is not an awesome time for church
No.
trauma. So
No.
I spent a lot of
No.
years not going to church, and I got physically ill every single Sunday morning.
Mm.
And I don't think I had any concept that there
Yeah.
was something
Trauma latent thing.
right, almost like a PTSD situation.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I spent a lot of years sitting at home. Here's another here's another thing your listeners will not remember, but making mixtapes off of the top 40 on my boombox during church while I was at
uh,
home.
oh man.
Those are
I'm sure
beautiful
there are a
memories, by
lot of our
the
listeners
way.
that will know about calling cards and mixtapes for
Good, I
sure.
hope
For
so.
sure. If you
But
do, leave us a comment. Leave us a
that's
comment.
right.
Tell
Tell
us
me your
that you know.
favorite mixtape
Tell
story.
us.
But I don't think I had any awareness at the time that the fact that I felt too ill to leave the house every Sunday for a long time was
Mm,
because I just couldn't be at a church. Um, but that has healed also. I'm actually an MDiv student now, if you can believe it,
mm,
getting a Master of Divinity at a seminary. So I've come
wow.
a long, long way.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I love church. I love serving the church. I have a beautiful vision for the church as the community that I know it can be.
Mm,
Um, I think one of the weird benefits of this happening when I was so young is that it totally rocked my faith.
mm,
But as I grew up and as I grew into faith, uh, this betrayal and this abandonment was coming with me all the time. And
mhm. Yeah.
so I, from the minute I decided in an adult sense to follow Jesus, to commit my life to the church, I knew how badly people could hurt me. I knew that
Yeah.
being a Christian doesn't shield you from pain. And the joy that I found in faith, the joy that I found in worshiping in community and serving in community and in Jesus, I have received all that with the full knowledge of the pain.
Mm,
And I think that has made so much
that's
difference.
great. Wow.
You know, one of my passions as a person and as a parent and as a writer is to just tell people again and again that beauty and suffering are all mixed up together in one.
That's right.
But God is here, God is right here. And when we suffer, it's not because God has somehow let down his end of the contract.
Yeah.
The Bible is really
Yeah.
clear that suffering is everywhere, that
Yeah.
following Jesus, if anything, is going to lead to more suffering. But God is here in the joy, God is here in the sorrow, God is here, God is here. So
Mm, that's so great.
I
That's
I
so
think
great.
because I stepped into my adult faith with this knowledge deep, deep in my bones, um, it is harder for me to trust church. I
Mm,
think for a lot of reasons. Some
mm,
having much more to do with this current day, like you're
yeah.
talking about the more recent pains, the more recent traumas.
Right.
I do tend to hold church and church community at a distance,
Mm,
although by God's grace, I'm still working on that. But I tell my kids it's like a family.
mm.
um,
Yep.
which is what church is supposed to
That's what
be,
it
right?
is. Yep. Mhm.
We hurt each other more. You know, who hurts you more than the people in your family, but who loves you
Yeah.
more?
Right.
And I can't say that the people that kicked my family out of town and left us with nothing loved me
Yeah.
more than anyone. But it's also been the body of Christ that picked us up again, bit by bit and slow by slow.
Mm,
So,
yeah.
yeah, there's that.
Wow. Yeah. I love that. You know, you are beginning to be able to and have begun to be able to divorce your experience with a group of people who are and were the church.
Hmm.
It's absolutely an adverse negative experience. You're beginning to be able to divorce that from like what Jesus desires for his
Hmm.
bride.
Yeah.
And rather than really partnering with that trauma, you're partnering with the redemptive purposes that
The
Jesus has.
vision.
And
Yeah.
you're beginning to get, yeah, you're getting your eyes around that vision of kingdom and going, okay, how do I play my part in making sure that this doesn't happen to other people, you know?
Absolutely.
And I think that is the point of all of this, of all of our suffering, you know,
Hmm.
that in it, like what you said, it doesn't mean God broke contract with us because he didn't tell us there wasn't going to be suffering. Jesus
No,
made it very clear there was going to be suffering. In this world, we'd have
absolutely.
sorrow. But in that, he invites us into these spaces where we can be the church to bring kingdom to this earth. And we can be about redemption and restoration and reformation where it needs to
Yeah.
be. And and that's where I think we begin to really start seeing some healing happen
Mhm. Mhm.
in our lives is
Yeah.
when we're going down that track and not partnering with our trauma.
Yeah. Yeah. One
Mm.
thing I love about Jesus is he, to be honest, he puts out a high bar, you know?
Yeah.
Absolutely, we are saved by grace. There's nothing we can do to earn God's love 100%. And that's where we have to start. There's nothing that we have to do to earn God's love or forgiveness or grace or affection. God is smiling on you right
Yeah.
now. God's face is turned towards you, and God's face is smiling.
Yeah.
But Jesus, not but,
And
and Jesus' invitation to us is that we live this crazy life on earth where we are pouring ourselves out for our neighbors and even for strangers and even our enemies,
yeah.
whom I've just spent a lot of time describing. Like, those are the people
Mm.
I am invited to pour myself out to in love.
Yeah.
And that bar is too high for me to meet, and I will
Mm.
die having not hit that bar. But I'm just so grateful that Jesus holds that bar out there and doesn't say, got to meet this or I'm not going to love you. God's love is the one that's
Mm.
pushing me. God's love is the one that's
That's it.
inspiring me.
Right.
And I will never hit the bar. I will die having never hit the bar, but I will have spent my
right.
whole life trying. And that
Right.
is so beautiful to me. And I
Yeah.
also think that that can be healing because I can now look at the church, and on any given day, the church to me feels like a neighbor, or the church feels like a stranger,
Mm.
or the church feels like an enemy. And in any of those cases, God's invitation to me is to love and pour myself out for the church. Not as a savior, that's Jesus,
Yeah. Yeah.
but as me, as Catherine McNiel, doing what I can do today to pour myself out. And I think that has been healing for me, and it's been insulating for me too. I don't need to
Mm.
worry so much about if I'm being hurt when I'm serving and when I'm giving.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
when I'm saying, yeah, I have been cut open.
Mm.
How can I help you? Uh,
Yeah.
Not from an unhealthy place, you know. Again, I'm 30 years in here, so not from an unhealthy place of denying my own needs and denying my own brokenness and leaning into that inner three. You know, that's I'm saying, but genuinely saying, God has met me and my wounds with love,
yeah.
and so, church, even when you are my enemy, and sometimes you truly, truly, deeply are, how can I love you with God's
Mm.
love?
That's great. Phew, that's great. Catherine, this has been so encouraging and I know helpful for everyone listening to this, regardless of the degree of hurt that they've experienced. We've all experienced hurt from people, and many of us from the very people who say they shouldn't, or somehow it seems like they shouldn't. And so I know this has just been really convicting for me to lean in a little bit further, as we want to lean into what you're doing and the books that you've written and this one that you just come out and you're writing and stuff. So how can we follow you and just kind of keep track of Catherine McNiel? We've been inspired by this conversation.
Oh, well, I hope you do. I love hearing from people. So I'd
Mm.
love for someone to reach out. The best place to find me is my website. It's catherinemcneil.com, but you do have to spell it right. Both of those names can be spelled in a million ways.
That's
So I'm
true.
sure
That's
that's
true.
on the show notes
We
somewhere.
will
But
make sure it's on the show
yeah,
notes. Yep. Hmm.
catherinemcneil.com is my website. And then you can sign up for my newsletter there. You can find links to all my books there. But Catherine McNiel is also my handle at just about every social media you can shake a stick at. So you could look up Catherine McNiel, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, as long as you spell it right.
Wow. That's awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Catherine. Thanks for sharing so vulnerably.
It's been so good.